Well, good morning. I am Michael Hite from the Bear Valley Bible Institute. We are continuing our study in the Gospel of Mark. I'm glad you're back with us. I sure do appreciate this time together. It helps me immensely. I hope it helps you as well. And we are in Mark chapter 15. So just to review a bit, we are in the midst of Jesus's suffering, his suffering statements in chapter 8, verse 31, chapter 9, verse 31, chapter 10, verse 33 and 34, all indicated that he would suffer many things. He would be put to death by the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. He'd be turned over to the Gentiles. They would kill him and he would rise again. And we have seen that arrest. We looked last week at the parallel between Peter and Jesus, how Mark seems to emphasize that Peter is the example of one who wants to follow, but won't. Ultimately, he'll deny the Lord instead. Jesus is contrasted as one who, in going to the garden and praying to the Father, demonstrates that he does not want to die, but yet he will do what the Father's will is. And so those two are contrasted here. But after Peter's denials are recorded, we really don't see Peter again in the book at all. He's mentioned in chapter 16. He's simply mentioned as part of the group of the disciples, but there's really no interaction or mention of him, his actions or his words personally throughout the rest of the book. Jesus becomes that example of the ultimate example of what he taught in chapter 8, verses 33 to 35, that if you want to follow, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross and follow. Now in chapter 8, he doesn't mean take up your physical cross. He will do that. We talked about chapter 8 doesn't mean that, we each will take up a physical cross, but the outcome is the same. We have to put our desires to death. We have to put our will to death. And Jesus is going to be the great example of one who is willing to do the Father's will, even by taking up a physical cross and allowing them to put him to death. And we recognize that he went to the chief priests and the high priest's house. They had a mock trial. Last week, we looked at all of the things that they did that violated their own laws in holding that trial and in bringing their witnesses, the conspiracy against them. We even noted that according to their own laws, the conspiracy that they created should have caused them to receive the death penalty rather than Jesus. But they are so hateful of Jesus. They're so vindictive at this point that all they have in their minds is they want him put to death. And they ultimately take him to Pilate, and Pilate sees through their scheme, but at the same time, he really doesn't want to get involved in the Jewish issues. And because of the crowd, verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd, he will ultimately have Jesus crucified. And that's where we left off, was in chapter 15, verse 15. And we covered the first half of that verse, but we intentionally didn't cover the rest of it. I really want to pick up in verse 15, wishing to satisfy the crowd. Pilate released Barabbas for them. We dealt with that enough in the last class, and having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. Now, this phrase only contains 5 words, and after having Jesus scourged. Mark does not give us any additional details. But if you remember, I've argued from the very beginning that this book was written to a Roman audience. They certainly would have understood what scourging was. And so Mark doesn't feel any need to elaborate on that. It's actually very brief, but we don't really understand, I don't think, what scourging is. And I don't mean this to get overly graphic for the sake of drama. I just want to help us understand what Jesus actually went through. A Roman scourge was basically a wooden handle wrapped with leather, and from that handle extended a number of strips of leather. And then along the length of each strip of leather, they tied sharp pieces of bone and metal and lead, and they used it to scourge people. Now, in many of the films that we've seen throughout the years, when they show somebody whipping, they kind of do the Indiana Jones kind of thing where they crack the whip, right? And just the very end will catch the flesh and tear the flesh. I grew up in Arizona. I was a swimmer. We used to have a special way that you could do that with a towel and make it crack like a whip. And it hurt a lot, but it wouldn't really cut the flesh like that. But the Roman scourge was used very differently. It really wasn't a crack the whip kind of issue. What they would do is they would typically strip the victim naked. They would usually chain their hands above their head to a post so that they couldn't lower their arms. And that would expose their entire back. They would take their clothes off of them. And then rather than crack it like a whip, the Roman soldier or the one performing the scourging would actually stand off to the side instead of directly behind the victim. He would stand off to the side and he would slap that scourge against the back. Now, what would happen is with enough force, slapping that scourge against the back, each of those small pieces, those sharp pieces of bone and lead and other sharp implements, would actually dig into the flesh. And then instead of pulling it away, he would pull it to the side. He would actually scrape it off. If you can imagine the agony of all of those small pieces of sharp metal and bone into your flesh and then ripping sideways. That's really what a scourging was. Now, I think it's very interesting that in the movie, The Passion of the Christ, Mel Gibson did a movie a number of years ago. And yes, we understand that it has some biblical inconsistencies, but if you've never seen that movie, I really do believe that every Christian should watch that movie at least once in their life. I will tell you right now, it's very, very difficult to watch. It's very graphic, but it really doesn't sanitize the Jesus's scourging and crucifixion and beating. It really does give us a sense of what he went through in a very graphic way. And as a matter of fact, the actor that played Jesus in that movie, in order to film the scene of the scourging, what they did was they created a metal mold of his back. They molded this metal shield that would fit directly onto his back, and they covered it with pig skin and makeup so that it looked like his back and so that they could simulate this Roman scourging. The problem was at one point, the guy that was doing the scourging missed the plate that was on his back. The scourge actually went around the actor's side and literally ripped his flesh. From what I understand, he now has a 14-inch scar there. And from the accounts that I've read, he almost passed out from the pain of just that one strike that went bad. Well, Jesus endured far more than that. His flesh would have been opened. The blood would have been immense. Most likely, It would have ripped his flesh to the point where bone was exposed. It would have been extremely gruesome. It was not uncommon for victims to be disemboweled during this process, to have their insides come out because the cage and the flesh that supports those inner organs would be so disrupted. It was not unusual for people to die just from the scourging. Now, we know Jesus doesn't die in that, but it's interesting that Mark, while he just says 5 words here, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The Roman audience would have certainly understood the horrors of what it meant to have Jesus scourged, the pain and the punishment of that, the agony that he went through, astonishing torture that they subjected him to. And we sometimes in the movie portrayals or even the pictures that we see portrayed of Jesus, even on the cross, we don't realize the brutality of what he actually went through. And so it says that after having him scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. This would certainly match the suffering statement in chapter 10, where he said that he would be handed over to Gentiles. He has been placed in the hands of the Romans, and now they are going to follow through with the execution and have him crucified. Verse 16, the soldiers took him away into the place that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. Now, the praetorium was a place of the Roman guard, part of the Antonius fortress. And so they took him to that place, and they dressed him in purple. And after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him. Now, there are a number of things here that we shouldn't overlook. First, they most likely stripped his clothing from him when they scourged him. That was typical of their practice. And now they dress him in purple. They place this purple garment on him. Imagine the amount of blood that is flowing from Jesus's back, and they place this garment around him. Now, again, I really am not trying to be overly gruesome. I'm not trying to be overly grotesque for the sake of dramatic effect. But if you've ever had a wound that has bled a lot and you put cloth over it, what happens? The blood soaks into the fabric rather quickly. That's the point, typically, as we're usually trying to stop the bleeding, but the blood flows into the fabric. But it doesn't take long for blood to start to coagulate, to dry. It was designed that way. God designed our bodies that way, to seal wounds and to scab over as quickly as possible to protect us from getting things into wounds like that. And it doesn't take blood long to start to coagulate. Well, imagine them placing this garment over his back, placing this purple robe, if you will, over his back. They then twisted together a crown of thorns. Now, I've had the pleasure of being on a number of mission trips to Africa, and mostly Tanzania, but a couple of other places as well. And in Africa, especially in Tanzania, East Africa, they have acacia trees. Now, my understanding is that acacia trees were also very common in this part of Israel. And so what acacia trees are is they actually have a very thick branch, but they have a very long, very, very sharp thorn. As a matter of fact, the Maasai tribes in Africa cut these branches and allow them to dry, and they make fences to actually herd their cattle. The cattle won't try to cross them, neither will the predators, because they're so sharp and pointy. And I'll be honest with you, every time I go and I look at those, I can't resist touching the end of one just to remind myself of exactly how sharp they are. And all I have to do is just very gently touch the end of them, and a drop of blood will appear on my finger. They are needle sharp. And I always imagine that this would be the kind of plant, the kind of bush that they would have used to twist this crown of thorns. Now, some people suggest that the crown would have been almost a complete helmet. Some would say that it would simply be a ring. We don't know. Most often it's depicted as a ring. Some argue that Roman helmets and crowns would have covered his whole head. I don't know that we need to split those hairs, but they twist this crown of thorns, and they put it on him. And they began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews." This was obviously a form of mocking that they used. But imagine placing a crown, a ring of these needle sharp thorns around your head, pressing it down. Now, the other thing that I've experienced in my lifetime is through first aid training and those kinds of things. One of the things you learn is that there are lots of blood vessels in the head. Head injuries bleed a lot. When you hit yourself in the head, or if you cut the flesh around your head, especially around the temples and those kinds of things, you can expect a lot of blood. And so imagine the pain of this crown of thorns. Other accounts show that they actually, beat him on his head with a reed. Here in verse 19, it mentions that, continually pressing this crown of thorns down on his head, driving those thorns into his flesh. You also have bone around your skull, and so those thorns wouldn't necessarily penetrate the bone, but imagine what would happen. I mean, if you use your fingernail and you just kind of press around your head, around your skull area, you realize that flesh is not very thick. There's not a lot of padding there. So those thorns would also strike the bone, slide along the bone. It would have been extremely painful. And they kept beating him on the head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling and bowing before him. And after they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him and put his own garments on him. And they led him out to crucify him. They continued to mock him and beat him. They spit on him. Imagine the humiliation. They were kneeling down before him. "Hail, King of the Jews." Remember, that was really the political accusation against him before Pilate. Pilate asked him if he was the King of the Jews, and Jesus said that he was. He doesn't mean in an earthly way, but that was enough for Pilate to go ahead and have him crucified. And so they mock him, they kneel down before him, they praise him. But again, just like they put the robe on him, notice that phrase in verse 20. After they mocked him, they took the purple robe off of him. In whatever amount of time it was, and we don't know how long, but imagine what's happened to that garment that is on his back. It certainly would have been soaked with blood. The air would have started to dry that blood on the fabric. And again, if you've ever had a wound like that, a wound that bleeds significantly, and you put cloth on it, especially if you don't use gauze, if you just use like a t-shirt or something to stop the bleeding, what happens? Well, when you start to take that fabric off, what happens? It reopens that wound, right? You have to almost pull it off. Well, they took the purple robe off of him. That would have certainly started the flow of blood on his back again. Would have been extremely painful, just even opening those wounds again. Again, the brutality and the heartlessness of this torture. The Romans knew how to torture victims. There's no doubt about it. They were masters. of torment and torture. And so they took the purple robe off him and put his own garments back on him. Well, when they place his garments back on him, what's now going to happen? That blood is going to soak into his garments again. And this whole thing is going to start all over again. And they led him out to crucify him. Verse 21, they pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Now, John's account in John chapter 19, verse 17, tells us that Jesus did himself begin to carry his cross. I just phrased that very weird. Sorry about that. But Jesus did begin carrying the cross by himself. John 19:17 tells us that. But it didn't last long. Again, there are some denominational groups that talk about Jesus falling 3 times while he carried the cross. There's no biblical evidence of that. When you visit Jerusalem, they'll show you the place, the stations of the cross, the passion, and they'll show you the places. They'll have a plaque at each place where Jesus fell. There's no biblical support for that he fell, but clearly he did not carry the cross for very long. The Romans realized he's been weakened most likely from the brutality that he's experienced thus far. Doesn't look like he'll make it to the place of the execution by himself. So they grabbed Simon of Cyrene to bear his cross. Now, there's always a debate, and again, I don't know that we need to spend a whole lot of time on this, but there's always a debate as to what Jesus was carrying. Was he carrying the full cross, the entire upright and the cross piece? Was he just carrying the cross piece? We don't know, and it's hard to determine from the text. The cross, Roman crosses, took on a couple of different forms. Some were X-shaped, some were T-shaped, and some were dagger-shaped. And what I mean by dagger-shaped is they were a T, but they also had that extension above his head, kind of like an extended plus sign, if you will. And that's most likely what we are used to seeing when someone has a crucifix that they wear as a jewelry item, a cross, or when you see photographs of the 3 crosses on the hill in silhouette. Typically, they're that dagger shape, and it's likely that it was that. We'll talk about why as we move through. But one of the things that they would do quite often is just have the victim carry the cross piece, not the entire post. We don't know that. Either way, don't imagine this to be a small piece of wood. Okay, that's my point here. When you talk about the cross is something that's large enough to support the weight of an adult human being for as much time as is necessary. Now, again, while we were in Israel, at one point, as we're walking through the streets of Jerusalem, following the way of the cross, if you will, the path that some believe, Jesus took through the streets of Jerusalem to the place of the crucifixion. Some people mimic that today and follow along, and they say prayers along that, but they carry a cross. Now, I thought it was very interesting that, first of all, the cross was made with boards that looked a little bit smaller than our 2x4s, very light pieces of wood, probably not strong enough to hold an adult human being for very long, especially once it's soaked with blood and those kinds of things. Secondly, there were wheels on the bottom end of the cross so that it made it much easier for them to carry. Don't imagine this to be a small item of wood. It would have been long enough for the arms to be outstretched. They want to extend the arms as far as possible in order to expose the lungs and expose the rib cage and make it hard for the victim ultimately to breathe. And so for me, I mean, we don't know how tall Jesus was. But typically, I mean, I'm a relatively tall guy, but they suggest that your wingspan, tip to finger, is the same as you are tall. So I'm over 6 feet tall. So this the cross member of a cross for me would have to be probably 7 to 8 feet, and stout enough to hold me up once I'm nailed to it. And so this would be a relatively significant piece of wood that needed to be carried. Now, if it also has the upright with it, you can imagine that it would be very heavy. And so the Romans grabbed Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander Rufus, to bear the cross for Jesus. Now, it mentions two things about Simon, this man in the crowd. Mark does. First, he's of Cyrene. It's hard to know whether Simon is in Jerusalem for the Passover. He's mentioned as a passerby coming from the country. That seems to indicate that he might be traveling into Jerusalem for Passover. Some suggest that he could be a resident of Jerusalem and part of a group that's mentioned in Acts chapter 6, verse 9, where it mentions a group of Jews from Cyrene that live in Jerusalem. We don't know, but the interesting part of Mark's account here is that he identifies Simon as the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, you always have to ask yourself the question, why include that detail? What is it about Alexander and Rufus that makes it significant enough to say that Simon was the father of these two men? Well, the suggestion is made, and I tend to agree with it strongly, that the early church would have been familiar with who Alexander and Rufus are. I mean, if I just say that this guy is the father of two people you've never heard of before, it really doesn't matter in interjecting that to the conversation. There's no reason for you to know that if you don't know who these two men are. But in this sense, Mark is very intentional about adding this detail to it, which would indicate that Alexander and Rufus are most likely known in the early church and known to the Christians of their time. Now, when we do some research, we find some very interesting things. We find in a set of writings called the Early Church Fathers, which are writings from basically the time of the Apostle John, late 100s or early 100s into 325 AD or so. We find writings that show two men connected with the apostles, most prominently connected with Peter and Andrew, named Alexander and Rufus. Now, those are not inspired writings. They are historical writings from the time. We know they have inaccuracies. We know they have exaggerations at some times, but it is interesting that both these men, Alexander and Rufus, are portrayed in those writings as companions of some of the disciples, certainly the apostles, most specifically. And so it seems to indicate that Alexander and Rufus are Christians. Well, why would they have become Christians? Probably because of the actions of their father in carrying the cross of Jesus. It certainly seems possible, I would suggest at least plausible, that this event in the life of their father, Simon carrying the cross for Jesus, opened the door for him to ultimately be taught, or at least for his sons to be taught the gospel of Christ later on, and they become Christians. Now, while there's no way to be certain, Romans chapter 16, verse 13 talks about a man, Paul talks about a choice man in the Lord whose name is Rufus. Is that the same Rufus that's mentioned here along with his brother Alexander? We can't be sure. We don't know for certain, but it seems plausible that it could be, especially since it's written to the Romans. We've talked about Mark being a Roman letter. It's very possible that Paul is referring to the same Rufus that we have here. Again, not going to be dogmatic about that, but the fact that Mark includes it here should be something we take note of and recognize that two men named Alexander and Rufus later on historically are shown to be Christians that work and travel with the apostles specifically. It seems that this interaction with Simon carrying the cross at least was possibly began the conversion process for at least the two sons, if not for Simon himself. And they brought him to a place, Golgotha, which is translated the place of the skull. Now, the location of Golgotha is somewhat in dispute. There is a place in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is located on the site of the crucifixion. There is also another place that's a little further out that some suggest looks more like a skull. And so they can't be positive, but it does seem that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in the correct place. And so they take him to that place. That the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is now within the city walls of Jerusalem. At this point in time, it would not have been, but it refers to the place of the skull. And they tried to give him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. Now, again, some suggest that wine mixed with myrrh would have been a mixture to help him tolerate or numb the pain that he was feeling. They argue that his rejecting of this is his way of experiencing all the pain that was necessary in his sacrifice. That doesn't necessarily need to be the case. There's a movie, Braveheart, that kind of depicts this idea at the end of the movie. And I hope I'm not, spoiler alert, this is an old movie about a Scottish man who leads a revolution. And at the end, they put him to death, and a woman tries to give him some medicine that will reduce the pain, and he spits it out. He won't take it because he wants to feel the full extent of the pain himself. And some paint this picture of Jesus as the reason he won't take it is so that he can feel all the pain that is necessary for the sacrifice that he was making. Myrrh is described as a bitter resin. And it may simply be that it tasted so badly that it was a way of them mocking him. It does not make a whole lot of sense that the Romans would do anything to reduce the pain of Jesus. They didn't care about the pain of their victims. As a matter of fact, they designed these tortures to be as painful as possible. Ultimately, they want him put to death. And so if he dies, he dies. No loss on their part. There's no reason for them to extend the situation for any length of time. It may just be that in recognizing the blood loss, recognizing the fact that he is most likely dehydrating because of the loss of fluid from his body, the blood loss would have caused dehydration. They offer him mockingly this wine, but they've mixed it with myrrh in order to mock him even more. We don't know. Again, I'm not going to be dogmatic about either one, but certainly there are a couple of options there. And verse 24, and they crucified him. Now, again, they don't go into great detail. Mark doesn't go into great detail about the crucifixion. Why? Well, again, writing to a Roman audience, the Roman audience would have been very, very familiar with the process of crucifixion. There's no reason to add all the details about the crucifixion to Mark's audience. He knows they're familiar with it. And so, but again, we're not. And so it does, the crucifixion itself is such. I mentioned earlier, one of the things that they would often do is lay the wood down on the ground, the cross piece and the upright. They would attach the two of them together. Then they would lay the victim on his back on that wood. Now, let's start there. What does Jesus's back look like? He's suffered a tremendous scourging. His back has been ripped raw. It has had garments placed on it and torn off at least once, probably twice at this point, when they take his garments off of him again to crucify him. And so they would strip the victim naked. They would lay him on that lumber. Now, this is another situation that we need to consider. What would the wood have looked like? Well, we're speculating, but don't think of lumber like you get from Home Depot. You know, so often we think of lumber and the wood that would have been used as, you know, sanded, planked kind of woods that have been, you know, cut to a specific size. This would have been very rough hewn wood. There's no reason for them to spend any time polishing this up and making it nice. And it would have most likely been sawn wood. It would have most likely been axe hewn wood. It would have been very rough. It would have had lots of splinters. It would not have been something that they spent any time trying to make smooth at all. And so they lay him on that wood. And then what was typical is that they'd have a hole in the ground and they'd raise the victim up once they nail him to the cross. We'll talk about that in just a second. They'd lift up the cross piece and slide the vertical piece into the hole, and it would kind of slide in place with a clunk, if you will. Now, it also would not have to have been nearly as tall as modern depictions demonstrate. When you see pictures of the cross, usually they show Jesus way, way up high, and the two thieves along with him. There would be no need for that. All they need to do is lift him off the ground. They don't need him, 8 feet in the air in order to put him to death. And oftentimes that wasn't the case. It needs to be taller than he is in order to lift him up off the ground and a place for his feet. But it doesn't have to have that super long extension like we see. He could have been very much in reach of the Roman soldiers, but up high enough that he is off the ground. And when they attach the victim to the cross, typically what was involved is they put a small block of wood underneath his feet, and they would lay one foot on top of each other, and they would drive a spike through the foot, and it would actually go through both feet into the cross. Now, the reason for that is they would do that with the legs slightly bent. The reason for that is that death on the cross is actually from asphyxiation. The victim dies from, in this case, blood loss, but crucifixion is, they didn't necessarily scourge everyone that they crucified. That wasn't part of it. They did with Jesus, but that scourging wasn't always part of crucifixion. So what would actually happen is once they nailed the victim to the cross is that they with their arms outstretched, the body eventually can't breathe correctly. Your arms would slowly sag, would stretch those muscles in your chest cavity out and would constrict your lungs. The lungs would slowly fill up with fluid. And what would happen is the victim would try to push up from their feet as they shrink down. They push up on their feet to try to take air into their lungs so that they can breathe. Well, imagine the agony of your feet being nailed to that wood. And when you try to push up, certainly that would be part of the torture. The pain involved in your feet would have been terrible. Now, again, when we think of the nails that would have been used, don't think of, 10 penny nails. These would have been substantial spikes, large enough to hold the full weight of an adult human being for as long as it took. No way to pull it out. No way for you to pull your flesh off of it. The head would have been quite substantial. These would have been more the size of a railroad spike, although much sharper than that, than a nail like we think of a nail today. And as far as attaching the arms, typically they would find a place in the wrist. Now, we talk about him having holes in his hands, and people saying, so it had to be in his hand. Well, pretty much everything from the wrist forward would have been considered the hand. That it doesn't necessarily mean the palm of his hands, but in the wrist, you'll notice if you even use your own thumb, you'll notice that you have two bones that run along here that are joined at the wrist joint. And right in between those two joints, there's a hole. If you use your thumb, you can actually, and you press hard, you can actually feel it. And quite often what the Romans would do is that's where they would drive the spike, because that would lock these two bones onto the wood, and there's no way for the victim to work his hand loose. If they put a spike through the center of your hand, what you could actually do is you could pull with enough force. Now, granted, it would be agonizing, but you could still do it. You could pull with enough force to tear the flesh up between the fingers and literally rip your hand off of the cross. Well, the Romans were never going to allow that to happen. And so most likely they drove the spike through the wrist to lock those two bones in place. Now, there's another point that you need to understand. And if you play around with it long enough, you'll find that right at the tip where those bones join together, you're going to find a nerve bundle. As a matter of fact, if you press with a fingernail or something small just right, you'll feel your hand go numb. As a matter of fact, just holding it right now very firmly, my thumb pressed to that part of my wrist, as I continue to hold this, I can feel right now my hand going numb. There are nerves and there are veins that go through there that are connected to the nerves in the hand, and that nerve bundle would have been very, very painful. The Romans know that, and that's why they choose that spot to drive the spike. It not only locks the arm in place, but it also causes extreme pain. And that's what they're trying to accomplish. And so they would lay the victim on their back. They would drive spikes through the wrist. They would drive spikes through the feet. Then they would lift the cross upright and slide it in place. Now, imagine with your hands piked to a piece of wood, that feeling when that wood slides into that hole and actually comes to, it would have put great pressure on those things, would have been even more painful. Again, the humanity of putting someone to death in this manner is grotesque. The fact that human beings would do this to other human beings is horrific. But to do this to an innocent man, to do this out of vengeance, to do this in order to keep control and power is even more heinous, is it not? I mean, to subject Jesus to this kind of punishment simply for speaking the truth, for representing God in the world, is astonishing. He didn't deserve this. And yet he was willing to do it because he knew that it was the Father's will. and he did it for us. And so in that phrase, they crucified him, you have all of that. And they divided up his garments among themselves, casting lots for them to decide what each man should take. And this would be an allusion to Psalm chapter 22, verse 18. We're going to look at Psalm 22 a little bit more in just a few minutes, but they divided up his garments. They cast lots to see who would get his possessions. This was common. They would keep whatever of the victims had any value at all. And so the Roman soldiers cast lots for his garments. And that was a fulfillment of the prophecy in Psalm 22:18. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. Now, again, the way time is recorded, the third hour would have been 9 a.m., roughly 9 a.m. in Jewish time. So they put him on the cross first thing in the morning. You remember they tried him the night before, but they met the next morning very early and then took him to Pilate. Well, notice how early in the morning they get all this done. Why are they so anxious to get this done so early? Again, they're worried about the crowds, are they not? They were worried about a riot. If they can get this done quickly, the crowds will not be a problem. The crowd is turned against Jesus anyway, but they're anxious to get this done as quickly as possible. And verse 26, the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And they crucified two robbers with him, one on his left and one on his right. Now, Mark doesn't include the detail, but there's an inscription of the charge against him that reads, "The King of the Jews." And in Matthew chapter 27, verse 37, it states that it was hung above his head. This seems to indicate that the cross is that dagger style cross that we see depicted in most of our interpretations. Not that it was an X-shaped cross. If it was simply an X, there really wouldn't be any place above his head to place this inscription. If it was a T-shaped cross, it would also be very difficult, at least initially, to put anything above his head unless that T was much, much higher than his head. Now, if the T was much higher than his head, there would have been room right above his head to place that inscription. So we're pretty convinced that it was either a T-shaped cross or a dagger-shaped cross that was used. And Matthew's detail of where this inscription was placed helps us identify that. And they crucified the two robbers with him, verse 27, one on his right and one on his left. Notice there's no mention of the conversation with the three robbers that's contained in others. That's not Mark's point. Mark's emphasis is going to be different on the cross. As a matter of fact, Mark's description of the crucifixion is the briefest of the three. There's no doubt about that. In verse 28, and the scripture was fulfilled, which says he was numbered with the transgressors. Now, it's interesting in chapter 15, verse 28, we have, again, we've talked about these before, but we have what we call a textual variant. It's kind of a fancy way to say that this verse is not contained in a lot of the early manuscripts that we have. And the people that put the manuscript evidence together and look at all of the verses and kind of determine which ones belong and which ones don't because of the manuscript evidence, give this an A rating, which means that they believe pretty certainly that it does not belong here. Now, I hate to do this in the middle of the crucifixion scene, but I think we need to stop and do here. There is a post that goes around Facebook pretty frequently that shows, and it'll warn you, notice these translations of the Bible that intentionally remove the following verses from scripture in order to deceive you. And they'll list these scriptures that the King James Version has, but that these other translations don't have. And the insinuation in the Facebook post, in the social media post, is that the translators chose to leave things out in order to keep important information away from you. And that's what makes those translations poor translations. And so you shouldn't use them. Brothers and sisters, that is not the case at all. Now, you will notice that if you look at a New American if you look at a New International Version, the NIV, or if you even look at the ESV, you're going to find something interesting. These verses aren't there. This verse 28, isn't there. But you'll notice that they still number the verses 1527 and then 1529. They just simply omit verse 28. Now, the New American Standard chooses to include it, but you notice if you use a New American Standard, it puts it in brackets and it gives you a footnote that says this verse most likely doesn't belong. It was not part of the early manuscript evidence. Others have chosen to remove it, but they've not changed the numbering, which would be now, if they were really seeking to deceive you, don't you think that they're going to notice that you're going to notice that verse 28 is missing? You see, it has nothing to do with deception. It has to do with the fact that this verse does not belong here. The vast majority of the manuscript evidence that we have do not include this particular passage. Somewhere along the line, it was added. It most likely doesn't belong. Now, again, that shouldn't give us any heartburn. When we talk about these textual variants, we're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of them. We're not talking about any verses that contain a particularly vital doctrine that if we remove it from Scripture, we have no other verses that support it. The fact that he was numbered with the transgressors doesn't take anything away from Mark's account at all to remove it. But please don't perpetuate the idea that this is a conspiracy, that translators have removed some of these verses as because they have decided that you don't need to know that, and that makes the translations poor. This all has to do with the underlying original manuscript evidence for these verses, okay? And we are confident that this verse does not belong here based on the manuscript evidence, all right? So, but note that there's no conversation. Mark doesn't account for the conversation with the robbers, but simply moves to verse 29, and those passing by were hurling abuse at him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ha, you who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself, come down from the cross." Now, earlier in the context, we saw where this came for. Now, as people are passing by, remember, they've moved from the place of the original trial. The original testimony was given at the high priest's house, which is some distance away from where the actual crucifixion took place. In the meantime, Jesus has been taken to Pilate. He's been taken to the Praetorium and tortured. He's been now taken to Golgotha to be crucified. He is not at the high priest's house anymore. And people that are passing by him on Golgotha are echoing what was testified about him in the high priest's house earlier, that he claimed that he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But Mark's account was very clear that was a lie, that they were not telling the truth, in that they were intentionally trying to find people that would testify to this, and they couldn't. But the fact that this is here in verse 29 and 30 is a point that we really need to spend some time with. And that is the idea that once something is said, whether it's true or not does not matter. It has legs of its own, does it not? I mean, here people lied in the trial about what Jesus said. Jesus never said that he was going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. As a matter of fact, John's account shows us that what he said was, you destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, talking about his body. He wasn't even talking about the temple, but they have distorted it in order to accuse him of defaming the temple, accusing him of making threats against the temple to defile the temple. And so they laugh at him while he's on the cross, and they bring up that accusation. Now, the accusation's not true, but there are people now that believe it as they walk past him. It's not that every passerby is lying in order to try to convict him, but they've heard what was said and they've passed it on to others who have passed it on to others, and it's gotten legs of its own. Brothers and sisters, this is a point that we really need to deal with in our current culture. And it rears its head in multiple ways, but it's extremely dangerous. I think we're seeing the side effects of it in our current culture in terrible, terrible ways. And the point is this: it doesn't matter if something is true or not when it's said. There are people that will believe it when it is spread. And that is really a tactic that's used politically. It's a tactic that's used socially. It's a tactic that's used to gain allies to your point of view. And there's a term for it that we've coined today, and it's called fake news. The idea that we can put out there something that appears to be true, even when it's not. News media outlets do it. Politicians do it. I would hazard to say even Christians do it. Now, sometimes Christians do it because they just pass along the information that they see online and they've done nothing to check to see if it's true or not. And so often in our current culture, if it fits our narrative, if it fits the way we believe, then we're going to pass it along because we believe it to be true, whether we've checked it to be true or not. And that's the danger. You see, isn't that what's happened with Jesus? There are some people that believe Jesus said that. Did he ever say it? No. Is it true? No. But they have passed it along. Are there now people that believe he said it? Absolutely. And that's wrong, isn't it? And we can be the instruments to pass along that false information and convince others to believe something that's not true. If we don't do the work we need to do to verify the information that we spread along, are we going to be the one in the crowd that says, wait a minute, did Jesus really say that? Were there witnesses, credible witnesses that really heard him say that? And where are they? And can you prove that? You know, we don't ask those questions today at all. If someone says something against a politician that you are in favor of, you almost immediately reject what was said against that politician as being false because it doesn't match your narrative. But if they say something against a politician that you're against, quite often we immediately agree that that's true and we pass it along. But is it true? Did that person say that? Is that what this group represents? Is that what this group really says? Is that what really happened? And we feed the monster of passing this along. And we do it with more than just social media posts. That's just one example. But we do it when we spread gossip about a brother or sister, don't we? You know, when we go to someone and say, I heard that so-and-so did such and such, and we tell somebody, do you know if that's true or not? Did you do the work to find out if what you just shared with that other person was actually true about that individual? Or did you just hear it and pass it along, whether it's true or not? Obviously, it fits your idea. It certainly could be true. And so I'm just going to share it. Well, you know what's going to happen? There are going to be people down the line that believe that to be true, that that person said it, and you don't know whether they said it or not. And you can damage a person's reputation. You can damage a person's career. You can damage a person's relationship with their family, with their church family, with the brotherhood as a whole. You can cause great damage to people's reputations simply by passing along gossip, and you don't even know if it's true or not. I have colleagues that I work with at the Bear Valley Bible Institute, and there are some things that are said about me as well. But I have colleagues that are accused of teaching certain things certain ways, and I can tell you right now, they don't teach it the way it's proclaimed out within the brotherhood. Someone heard that someone said that this guy said this at this particular place and passed it along. And it's gotten to the point where now they believe that this colleague believes and teaches a certain thing. When in reality, no one ever called my colleague and asked specifically, do you teach this? What do you believe about this? Can we sit down and talk about this? No one ever asked. But, we'll be out on lectureship and I'll be talking to somebody and they'll say, you work with that guy and he teaches this, doesn't he? And my answer is no, he doesn't. I've worked with him for many, many years. I can testify directly to you that he doesn't teach what you just said. Well, I've always heard that he does. You see, isn't that what's happened here with Jesus? It is a lie was told, an untruth was told, but some heard it and believed it, and some then passed it along to others. And now there are a group of people that believe that Jesus said this. And that's the way this works. Accusations made against somebody without addressing them and getting clarification is a dangerous road to walk down. And I would argue that it's sinful. It is gossip. And gossip is spoken against in Scripture. Many places will tell us that speaking about someone else in a situation that can cause harm or damage to their reputation without knowing the truth is sinful. And we need to stop. We need to stop just casually clicking the share button on Facebook and not think through, is what I'm sharing true? Is, one of the situations that I find is interesting, and that is there are a couple of websites. One was called The Onion. The other one is called the Babylon Bee. And these are sarcastic spoof websites. They create these fake stories in order to be funny. They don't really expect anyone to take them seriously. They know that they're being sarcastic. They know that I can't think of the word that I'm trying to describe what it's called other than sarcasm right now off the top of my head. It ever happened to you where the word just leaves your head? But they're these spoof sites that make up these stories, and they seem very detailed, but they're not true, and they don't claim them to be true. But every now and then on Facebook, I'll see members or friends that'll post these things railing against what they said in these articles. This is an abomination in our culture. This should never be the case. This political person really said that. Well, they never said that. It was supposed to be funny, but somebody read it, believed it, and passed it along, right? And didn't do the due diligence to ask the question, is it true? Is it edifying? Does it build up or does it tear down? Instead, we just casually say, yep, I can see that being the case. I'm going to share that so everybody knows. Brothers and sisters, it's got to stop. We've got to stop being the conduit through which fake news, gossip about others, false information continues to be perpetuated. Do a Google search. Ask yourself, is this true? Do at least a little bit of due diligence to find out whether it's true or not. And if it's not true, don't share it. If it's true, still ask yourself, why am I sharing it? Am I sharing it to destroy, or am I sharing it to build up? Am I sharing it to do damage to someone else, or am I sharing it in order to edify and build up the culture that I live in? We really need to ask ourselves those questions before they do that. And Mark is demonstrating the truth of the dangers of fake news and gossip. The gossip has reached the ears of the passersby, and as they walk by Jesus on the cross, they mock him about his saying that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And so they say, save yourself, come down from the cross. Basically, if you're the Christ, come down from the cross. Notice verse 31, in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes, were mocking him. So they were mocking him in the same way as the passersby were. Now, again, the suffering statements in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10 all have focused on the actions of the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. Who do we see even after Jesus is placed on the cross at the center of what's going on? The chief priests and the scribes. They're still there. Haven't they already gotten what they wanted? Isn't he already on the cross? He's certainly not going to come down from that cross alive. Is there a reason to continue the torment? They've won, haven't they? They've gotten what they were after. Why continue mocking him? Because it's not about justice. It's not about righteousness. It's about vindication. It's about their hatred. It's about their vindictive nature to get even, not simply for them to get justice. And so they mock him in the same way, saying he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let this Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross so that we may see and believe. Really? They're asking for a miracle at this point in time? Have they not seen miracles before? Isn't that Mark's purpose in the first 8 chapters? 20 miracles recorded in the first 8 chapters that many of these religious leaders know about and saw, and have witnesses, hundreds of witnesses that can testify to them. And now they claim that if they see another miracle, they'll believe. They've never believed any of the miracles they've seen. They've seen the action. They've missed the sign, haven't they? But notice their phrasing. Let this Christ, the King of Israel. You see, they don't believe him to be Messiah. And even if they did, this kind of shows their earthly kingdom mentality. Let the King of Israel come down and reign, right? We'll believe then. That'll prove that he's the Christ and he's here to set up his earthly kingdom. But Jesus's kingdom, the Messiah's kingdom, is not of this world. He has no intention of setting up an earthly throne to reign the way they think. He's going to establish the church. He's going to reign through the church, but he's not going to reign the way they think. He's not a king the way they have in their mind, just like David sitting on the throne of David. And he's not going to come down from the cross, because he has his answer from God. The cup cannot pass from him. He is the atoning sacrifice for sins for all men, and he is going to die on that cross. He's not going to give them another miracle. And even if he did, it would be questionable as to whether or not they would believe or not. But they know they've won. And so in mocking him, they profess to suggest that they might believe, but they've proven in their hardness of heart throughout Mark's gospel that no amount of miracles is going to change their mind. And those who were crucified with him were also insulting him. The isolation and the aloneness of Jesus in these moments is so critical to Mark's account. Everyone has left him. His disciples have all fled. Peter, his closest companion, has denied him. The religious leaders that he came to save have rejected him. The Romans have rejected. Everyone is against him. He is totally alone in this moment. Even those that are going to die alongside him are insulting him. Imagine the torment of that kind of sacrifice. And when the 6th hour came, verse 33, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. So the 3rd hour was 9 a.m. when he was crucified. When the 6th hour came, so he's been on the cross at that point for 3 hours, darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour. So you have 3 more hours. So it's now 3:00 p.m. But notice darkness fell over the land from noon until 3 p.m. In the middle of the brightest part of the day, the land went completely dark. Obviously, this is a miraculous event. The sun does not stop shining in the middle of the day. Now, some argue that it must have been some kind of a storm and clouds came. The word here would indicate a lack of light, that the sun actually did not shine. Not that it was covered up by something, but that it's quite possible that the meaning is that the sun didn't give off its light for 3 hours. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, he speaks Aramaic here on the cross, and some use that to say Jesus only spoke Aramaic. I don't know that we can prove that. The New Testament that we have is written in Greek, and the words of Jesus are recorded in Greek. Clearly, Jesus was familiar with Aramaic as well, but he quotes here from Psalm 22. Now, the interesting part of this, and we need to spend a little bit of time on this, is that he's quoting from Psalm 22, where when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus certainly is aware that he's quoting from Psalm 22. So from that part really can't be argued. The question becomes, did God really forsake him? And I realize that what I'm about to say, many of you will hear and disagree with, and that's okay. I get that. But stay with me for a few minutes. The concept is presented that the reason that Jesus says this on the cross is because God has been forced to turn his back on Jesus. God cannot be in the presence of sin. Jesus has taken the sin of the whole world on himself on the cross. God cannot be in the presence of that sin. So God has literally turned his away from Jesus in this moment. And Jesus is telling us that with this statement on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there's no doubt that Jesus feels forsaken, but he's quoting from Psalm 22. And if you have your Bible, flip over to Psalm 22 with me for just a second, because we need to look at this Psalm and understand that Jesus was clearly familiar with this entire Psalm, not just the beginning of it. Now, if you turn to Psalm 22, look at verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? And this was a psalm that David wrote while he was being persecuted, while he was running from King Saul. David was writing this. He felt alone. He felt isolated. He felt like the Lord had abandoned him in this time. And he goes on, far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. Oh my God, I cry by day and you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. And that is what Jesus is quoting. Now, did David believe that God had forsaken him? Well, the answer really is no. He felt forsaken, but as you read the rest of this psalm, and we don't have time to read the entire psalm, But notice verse 3. Yet you are holy, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. And he goes on to talk about how God has faithfully delivered. Notice verse 9. Yet you are he who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. David says, I feel forsaken, but I know that's not the case. I've trusted you my whole life, and that trust has been well placed. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Verse 11, many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open their mouth at me as a ravening and a roaring lion. Does that sound like the abuse that Jesus is receiving on the cross? I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax and is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death. He knows he's going to die, doesn't he? For dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierce my hands and feet. This is a messianic psalm. He's talking about himself. David is talking about himself, but he's revealing what's going to happen to the Messiah. I count all of my bones. They stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing, they cast lots. We talked about that fulfillment earlier. But you, O Lord, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen. You answer me. I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. He's testifying about for others to trust in the Lord. All of you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. All of you descendants of Israel, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. Notice the end of verse 24. Nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. Jesus feels abandoned. He feels forsaken. But David did too. But by the end of Psalm 22, what does David say? I know you hear me. I know you're with me. Jesus knows that too. So why is this here? And some will argue Jesus never said anything that wasn't true. And so therefore, if he said this and it wasn't true, it was a lie. And if it was a lie, it was a sin, and Jesus was no longer the sinless sacrifice. I don't believe Jesus is saying anything here that's not true. We need to remember that Jesus is 100% God, but he's also 100% man. That he's human just like we are. Yes, he's God. But if as deity he is expressing emotion, then why does he feel physical pain? Why was he troubled and anguished in the garden? You see, those were human emotions. He knew what was about to come upon him as deity, as God. He knew what was going to happen to him. But the human side of him was distressed and troubled. The human side of him did not want to go through this agony. And on the cross, the human side of him feels as though, just as David did, that God has forsaken him. But let's consider the theological impact of God forsaking him on the cross. If it is true that the Father forsook him, then what does that mean for the Godhead? Does that mean that at some moment on the cross that the Son was not part of the Trinity Godhead, that he was not part of the divine, that the Father walked away from him and somehow separated him. I hear that word used a lot, that Jesus is expressing the anguish of the first time ever being separated from the Father. Well, if he is separated truly as deity separated, then was there a moment in time where the Godhead only consisted of the Father and the Spirit and not the Son? No. Was there a moment in time where we had two deities? The Son, separate from the Father. The Father is God, the Son is God, but since they've been separated, we must conclude that there's two gods. No, of course not. What we're seeing here is Jesus' humanity on the cross. He feels forsaken, but he understands the rest of Psalm 22, just like we will if we read it. And we realize that David understood that even in that moment of anguish, feeling that God had forsaken him, that God hasn't forsaken him. Verse 24, I have appealed to you and you have heard me. Why is that so important? Because there's going to come a time in your life when you're going to wonder if God has forsaken you. There's going to come a time in your life when you're faced with some tragedy, you're faced with some affliction, you're faced with some persecution, you're faced with some challenging that is so monumental that you may lift your eyes to heaven and say to yourself, God, why have you walked away from me when I needed you most? And if in that moment you remember the cross and remember that Jesus, in his moment of greatest need, God walked away from him too, you might easily lose your faith. But the Father didn't forsake and walk away from Jesus. He was there with him. Jesus knows that God has heard him. But the struggle is, the answer to Jesus's question is, no, I can't save you from this cup, isn't it? Jesus's humanity feels that separation, but God is with him through this. God's going to raise him from the dead. Number of scriptures that talk about Jesus laying his life down and picking up. There's a number of scriptures that talk about God raising him from the dead. The Godhead has not been shattered in this moment. It's not been fragmented into pieces, and the Father has not walked away from the Son. Jesus feels that. But when we read the rest of Psalm 22, we recognize that both David and Jesus know that God hears. But there are times when we appeal to God and say, I don't want to go through this, and the answer from God is, I'm sorry, my child, you must. And in that moment, we have to choose whether we believe God forsook us or whether God is with us. And when we choose to think that God has walked away, we can easily lose our faith. We can blame God. And don't we see that happen? Why did God allow this to happen to me? Why did God abandon me this way? Why did God give me this disease? Why did God take my child? Why did God do this? Why did he walk away? When in reality, he didn't walk away. He will guide us through the trial if we'll stay with him. And Jesus knows that. Mark is showing us the isolation and the humanity of Jesus on the cross. He feels forsaken, but he's quoting a psalm that concludes with the trust in God to get you through anything that you have to deal with. And Jesus knew that as well. And so when you read this, don't always think about God turning his back on Jesus because of sin. I think there's another argument to be made, and we won't chase this rabbit too far. But while it is true that sin cannot be in the presence of God in heaven, is it true that God himself cannot be in the presence of sin. The doctrine or this teaching that derives itself from, Jesus took on the sins of the world, which is true. We see that in multiple scriptures, but Jesus took on the sins of the world, and God cannot be in the presence of sin. When we study that out, you're going to realize that scripture says that sin cannot be in the presence of God, not that God cannot be in the presence of sin. And there's a difference, because isn't Jesus God? He has claimed to be. He's demonstrated that he is. And isn't he been in the presence of sin? You see, as soon as God chose to leave heaven to come to earth, he put himself in the presence of sin. I think that testifies to the fact that God can be in the presence of sin. God will not allow sin to be in his presence in heaven. And there's a difference there that we need to wrestle with and study with. So I leave you with those thoughts about that. You may disagree with me. I understand that. But read through Psalm 22. Place all of Psalm 22 in the mind of Christ at this moment on the cross. And study through that. And I think you might see it a little bit different. Verse 35, when some of the bystanders heard it, they began saying, "Behold, he is calling for Elijah." It seems that the words, the Aramaic term for Elijah sounds similar to Eloi, sounds similar to the word Elijah. Now, also recognize, and this is something that we do, is that Jesus's words on the cross would not be like words that I'm uttering to you right now. He has been beaten and his face has been disfigured. He has suffered tremendous trauma with the beating on his head, the crown of thorns, them punching. His face is swollen and sore. His body is hypothermic. His body is dehydrated, most likely. He is, to even get enough air to speak words would have been a challenge. This isn't just simply a clear statement. And they hear it and say, "See, he's calling for Elijah." Someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. Now, unlike the wine that was mixed with myrrh earlier, it just says someone, in Mark's account, ran to offer him some sour wine. Now, again, many suggest that this is a continuation of the mocking, but sour wine was actually a common drink issued to Roman soldiers. It was a mixture of wine and vinegar, and it was used to relieve thirst in a more effective way than the normal wine would. The vinegar in it helped restore the body's fluids in some ways, and it was also cheaper, and so it was the favorite wine of poorer folks. Roman soldiers had it issued to them. It would have been at hand. It seems that somebody is trying to reach out and offer Jesus some relief from his torment, and gave it to him to drink. They said, "Let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Elijah's not going to come. He wasn't calling for Elijah. They're still mistaking Old Testament passages about Elijah. We know that Elijah did come. It was John the Baptist. And so at some ways, they're mocking him into the end, even to see if Elijah will come, someone greater than himself. They don't see him as the Messiah anymore. They don't see him as king. They see Elijah as someone greater. But Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now, the veil in the temple, and we're running out of time here, but the veil of the temple was that which divided God, the holy place, from the most holy place. The high priest was only allowed to enter once a year, the presence of God. And so when Jesus died, the veil is torn in two from top to bottom, and demonstrates that now people have access to God directly. It's a symbol. This miracle is a sign. I think it's part of the fulfillment of chapter 13, that the Jewish system, the temple system, is going to be destroyed. But now we have access to God directly through the sacrifice of Jesus. We can talk to God directly. We don't need a high priest. We don't need a holy of holies. We don't need a most holy place. We have access to God directly because of the sacrifice of Christ. And that miracle of the veil being torn in two represents that. All right, well, we've run out of time. We'll pick it up with the confession of the Roman centurion on Tuesday. We may still be able to finish on Tuesday. We might need a short class on Thursday, or maybe even a longer class on Tuesday. We'll talk about how we might do that. But we're going to stop here for the day because our time is up. I thank you for your diligence. You have been great. You've stuck with us through now over 30 hours of studying this. If you think about that, at 90 minutes of class, that's roughly 45 Bible classes. You've been through almost a year of studying on Sunday morning, 45-minute Bible classes on the Gospel of Mark. We've got just a little bit more to go. And stay with me into next week, and we'll finish the Gospel of Mark. I pray that this has been a blessing to you. I thank you for your diligence, your willing to study, your willingness to look at these things and try to apply them in your life. I pray that we challenge ourselves, especially this week in light of the teachings that we've talked about, to think about the things that we share online, to talk about what's true, to work to encourage people, to lift up folks instead of tear down, to be careful what we say and guard our tongues, but also to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made on that cross willingly so that we might be saved. He does this to save us, not himself. And that was God's will. He has become the ultimate example of deny self, take up your cross and follow. And I pray that we will be those examples to others of those that deny themselves, take up our cross every day, put ourselves to death, our will to death, and follow the God that we serve. Thanks for your time. We'll pick this up 10:30 Eastern, 8:30 Mountain on the Connect Digital Bible Network Facebook page and YouTube channel, on the Bear Valley Bible Institute Facebook page and YouTube channel. Until Tuesday, may God bless you and keep you safe. Thanks for your time.